magnetize your minis, flight stands, custom kits, and all the hobby supplies you'll need from themagnetbaron.com.
Hello and welcome to the YouTube channel for craftworldeldar.com. I'm Brent, and in this video, I'm going to be talking about the most effective ways to use Windriders in Warhammer 40k as an Eldari player, and also how to build and run an effective Craftworld Saim-Hann list for more competitive play rather than just pretty forgiving narrative games where you can get away with just about anything. And it's an especially good time to be talking about Saim-Hann lists because for the first time in 10th edition a few weeks ago in a small GT in New Zealand, Shane Runganawi, apologies Shane if I don't have your name quite right, I'm not familiar with New Zealand names, ran a truly thematic, literally all jet bike Eldari list and finished fourth in this 37 player GT, which is pretty darn good. I will talk a little bit about Shane's list. I'll refer to it here and there, but I'm not going to spend a ton of time unpacking it because a week ago, Proxy Hammer made a video exclusively about this. So if you want more on Shane's list, you can go check out Proxy Hammer's video. So instead, I'm going to talk specifically about Windriders for a while, and then we'll talk about expanding into a generalized Saim-Hann list and what that looks like and what things synergize well and are consistent with the theme and some principles to consider building around if this is something you want to do. And I don't think you necessarily have to do a no boots on the ground Saim-Hann list. That's certainly not how they've looked in classic issues of White Dwarf and stuff. It's fun. I've run lists like that. I think all bike lists are fun, but I think you can definitely run a highly thematic Saim-Hann list that is not totally a purist bike list. So we'll discuss what that looks like. My general principle for Craftworld specific list construction is you figure out what tools and play style are specific to a particular Craftworld, and then you want to make sure that the heavy lifting, that is most of the target elimination and ideally the scoring, are being done by the units that are archetypally associated with this type of Craftworld, and then to try to have a play style with the other units that you're including that are consistent with the vibe and the flavor of that Craftworld. So first we'll talk Windriders, and then we'll talk more generally about the other units that I think obviously not only make sense, but probably belong in a Saim-Hann list. I think you generally want to have Shroud Runners. You want all the Craftworld bikes, right? So you need Shroud Runners. You definitely need Vipers. I think you probably have to have a unit of Shining Spears, even though they're not great. And I think there's also a pretty good argument for Hornets as pseudo jet bikes. And then there are a bunch of other tertiary units that I think fit the play style and the vibe, but are not obviously jet bike Saim-Hann units, but you still may want to draw on to flesh out your list. So we'll talk about those too a little bit. Oh, in addition, on the character front, the Farseer Skyrunner, I think Saim-Hann lists, I think a good Saim-Hann list right now probably wants two of these things. They're fabulous. Guide is an incredibly powerful tool. And then you may also want to think about, if you're really devoted to the narrative, you could include an Autarch Skyrunner, although I think that is the most purely narrative Saim-Hann include. I think that the Wayleaper is much better and also has some sort of a similar Saim-Hann play style. You could get away with it. And the other thing would be Warlocks on jet bikes, either the Conclaves or the individual Skyrunners. I like the individual Skyrunners. I'm not really sold on the Conclaves except in pretty casual play. And last note before we talk Windriders, my most recent video before this one is all about the Farseer Skyrunner. I strongly recommend that you watch that video first or in addition to this one. The deep dive on the Skyrunner, I think, will be very useful to you, as it is a clutch unit in any Saim-Hann list. Okay, but let's talk Windriders. So Windriders are the most archetypally Saim-Hann unit. They're guardians on jet bikes. Now, Saim-Hann Windriders are called Wild Riders, and Saim-Hann is this like culture of honor with wide open spaces on their craft world that favor mounted combat. And even though on any other craft world, anybody in a guardian role is not really first and foremost a warrior, this is a little bit different on Saim-Hann, where Wild Riders really are warriors. I assume that when we get an index, there will be some detachment bonus that's obviously geared towards Saim-Hann bike lists that will in some way reward us for running lots of Wild Riders. But currently that's not a thing. So your Saim-Hann list is necessarily going to include a bunch of Windriders, and frankly, Windriders are pretty good. They come in squads of 3, 6, or 9. They can be led by a Warlock on a jet bike, a Farseer on a jet bike, or both, which is kind of neat. They can be outfitted with twin-linked shuriken catapults, with shuriken cannons, or with scatter lasers. Generally, you almost exclusively want the cannons. There is possibly a small argument for scatter lasers on like one unit. Windriders have a 14-inch move. They're toughness 4. They've got a 3-up save, which is better than in some previous editions. They have 2 wounds, the standard leadership 6-up, and then an OC of 2, which is nice. A little bit of extra jet bike control for objectives, which is cool. And then they have this ability, Swift Demise. Each time a model in this unit makes a ranged attack that targets the closest eligible target, reroll a hit roll of 1. If it's targeting a unit that's in range of an objective, you can just reroll the hit roll instead. Now, it's important to note that the way this is being played in most places by most people, at least in more competitive settings, is that if the enemy unit that you're targeting is on an objective, you reroll the hit roll. It does not have to be the closest unit. So if it's the closest unit, you reroll 1s. If it is on an objective, regardless of whether it is the closest unit, you just reroll the hit die. And the reason that people think that this is the case is because the Swift Demise ability has a corollary in the Necron Codex, which is identically worded. It has exactly the same wording as Swift Demise, and it was clarified at some point when the Necron Codex dropped that by GW that it doesn't have to be that the reroll to hit takes effect if the enemy model is on an objective, even if they're not the closest. And because Swift Demise has the same wording, generally people are assuming that it's safe to assume it works the same way, even though GW has only officially weighed in on the version of the rules in the Necron Codex. Now, one other fun fact about Windriders is that they have 3 melee attacks, which is cool. That's most Guardians have 1 standard, and then like most aspect warriors have 2, and then melee aspects have 3, but Guardians on jet bikes just have 3. I mean, they have strength 3 and no AP, so, don't get too excited, but 3 attacks is not nothing. If you've got a big block of Windriders that needed to charge and finish something off on an objective to get onto the objective or something, it's not the worst. But it's also not like you're going to be pulling that trick a ton. There are currently basically 2 ways to play with Windriders. One is to treat them as a target elimination unit, and if you're going to treat them as a target elimination unit, they need to be combined with overlapping buffs and probably investments in stratagems. So if, for example, you have a unit of 9 Windriders, and in this case, it's going to be a big unit. So you max out the unit of Windriders if you want it to be predominantly target elim. So if you have a unit of 9 Windriders and you stick a Warlock in it, Warlocks can give the squad that they lead either Conceal, which just gives them cover no matter what until your next command phase, in your command phase, or Reveal, which lets them ignore cover, which is great. There's so much cover in 10th edition that this basically amounts to an extra AP. So if you have a squad of 9 Windriders and you have a Warlock leading them, and you've got a Farseer either in the squad or nearby to throw Guide on them, they put out kind of a ridiculous amount of fire. Now, Guide lets you reroll hit rolls, and you might be thinking, well, Brent, but I can do that anyway because of the Swift Demise ability. And I think that what you're going to find if you do start playing around with big blocks of Windriders and Saim-Hann is that While Swift Demise is great, you do also want the Farseers in your list, the mounted Farseers, because frequently the stuff that you really need to target, if you're playing a Saim-Hann list, you will need your big Windrider blocks to have pretty diverse target elimination options. You do not want to be limited to targeting stuff on objectives to really get the most out of them. So having the option to throw guide on them with a Farseer Skyrunner against something that's not an objective really puts their damage output into the next weight class because of some synergies that exist with the Shuriken Cannon. So I talked about this in my Farseer Skyrunner video, but the Shuriken Cannon fires 3 shots, but then has sustained hits 1. So guide on a big mob of 9 of these things, putting out 27 shots, and then having the ability to reroll the hit roll to generate even more 6s is really good. If you're also running a list that has Shroud Runners, I'll talk about these a little bit later, but Shroud Runners can pick a unit within 12 inches and give units in your army lethal hits in the shooting phase against whatever it is. And this lets Windriders be dangerous to stuff that normally would be a little bit out of their weight class in terms of toughness. So the strength on the Shuriken Cannon is a 6, which is really good because that means even stuff that's like 10 or 11, they're still wounding on 5s, which with that volume of fire, especially with rerolls to hit and sustained hits, is really pretty good. But if you do have to target something that's toughness 12 and you're only wounding on 6s, the ability to do lethal hits on the front end is pretty important to make Windriders a viable threat into something that's really tough. And then although they put out a ton of damage, they're very fragile. A Windrider is as tough as a Space Marine, and most people are teched to be able to kill Space Marines pretty efficiently and effectively. So your opponent probably has a couple of units or more in their army that will just absolutely annihilate a squad of Windriders if it's caught flat-footed out in the open. So you generally want to figure that you're only going to be exposing 1 unit of Windriders per turn to serious, like to the opponent, and then you use Fire and Fade, right, for 2 CP. So you move them to safety, and then elsewhere on the table, if you have multiple squads, because you're running Saim-Hann, that would be the reason to have multiple big squads. You can set it up so that like you've got your 1 unit of Windriders that Fire and Fades, and then another unit of Windriders that's like hanging out there, but it's only vulnerable to a few units in your opponent's army and as an opportunity to trigger Overwatch. And the other cool thing about Guide and Sustained Hits is that it has insane synergy with Overwatch. So, for example, if you move a unit of Windriders into the open, where it can only be engaged by your opponent's quick units, like maybe in my Farseer Skyrunner video, I talk about a situation in a tournament I played at that time. It was recent, not so much now, in which I was in a mirror match and my opponent also had a big blob of Windriders, but I didn't really need to worry about my opponent's big blob of Windriders because to pop out and target my unit of Windriders, they had to absorb Overwatch fire. So if you have Guide on your Windriders and you have sustained hits, you put out 27 shots, only 6s hit, but you re-roll everything that's not a 6 for Guide, and then all of those 6s actually score 2 hits. So you score a bunch of hits, and the damage output on those Shuriken Cannons can do serious damage to something like a big unit of Windriders or a light tank or other bike unit, or the sort of thing that's likely to be quick enough to get a bead on them. The Overwatch on Windriders, when they have Guide on top of sustained hits on the Shuriken Cannon, is one of the best reasons to have them in their list. I mean, that's your list, excuse me. It's an incredibly powerful tool. So they're really good because they can absolutely massacre heavy infantry. They absolutely massacre light infantry. If you have the ability to throw lethal hits on something, they can do serious damage to something that's even T12 or better. And even without lethal hits, they're still decent into something that's T9 or T10. And then as a scoring unit, they're good. That 14-inch move and the ability to potentially advance means that they can get into difficult to reach table quadrants, your opponent's backfield, or they can be one of those units that on turn 1, if you draw into that secondary that requires you to be in corners of the board, they can drop back to a corner of the board without being sort of taken out of the game for later turns of play. They have a lot of versatility as both a killing and a scoring unit. They're also especially good, I think, right now because suddenly there's this orc meta with like mobs of very durable orcs, and this is a type of fire that's very effective into those sorts of opponents. So they're really good, and the biggest issue with them, the biggest challenge to using them effectively is that they're very fragile. And so, again, you're going to deal with that with Fire and Fade on one unit, and then judicious use of Overwatch with another one, and just being really careful about about knowing how far your opponent's models can move and what can get a beat on them and what can't. Now, and it's important too to think about, if you don't have access to guide, don't forget about the bonus that comes with targeting the closest unit or targeting enemies on objectives. Because even if you are running a true Saim-Hann list and you have 2 Farseer Skyrunners and they each have guide, regardless of whether or not they're in your Windrider squads, and I think there's a good argument for sticking them in there just for ablative wounds, and generally they're kind of where they need to be on the battlefield. But you don't have to stick them in there to get the bonus from guide the way you do with the Warlocks. Even if you have those Farseer Skyrunners, there may be other stuff in your list that on various turns you want to throw guide on. If you've got a big unit of Swooping Hawks, guide can be really good on those. You know, there's other stuff. So remembering that you don't necessarily need guide in order to get rerolls and picking your targets accordingly can be important. Now, the other build you might consider with a big unit of Windriders that's also going to multi-class into target elimination is scatter lasers, either a big unit of like 9 with scatter lasers or a unit of 6. Scatter lasers fire 6 shots. They're only strength 5. They hit on 3s, but they have a 36-inch range, unlike the 24-inch range on the Shuriken Cannon. And they're particularly good into stuff like orcs, stuff that's lightly armored but pretty tough. They're also very good into light infantry. I do a little bit wish they were strength 6, but strength 5 is still good. If you are going to include a unit with scatter lasers, they can, in some matchups, you can try to use that 36-inch range to outrange the enemy, so you don't have to use Fire and Fade, or you don't have to rely on robust Overwatch fire with this particular unit. So you've got 3 units participating in the battle. They're picking up stuff at extremely long range. And here's a moment where you may want to consider using the Bladestorm stratagem. So the Bladestorm is a 1 CP stratagem that gives an additional -2 AP on 6s to wound. Now, if you're putting out a ton of shots, you'll have a reasonable number of 6s to wound potentially, and this can matter. If you are going to pull this trick and you're going to use a big unit, it might be worth sticking a Warlock in there, so you can also use Reveal and strip stuff of cover saves, so then your 6s are maybe a little bit more like -3 AP. It's not necessarily bad. Into most of the targets that are good in the game right now, Shuriken Cannons are better. But again, into some orc builds, you may do pretty well with that scatter laser. Although I will say, some of those orc builds have a feel no pain, so the 2 damage on the Shuriken Cannon can be helpful. But regardless of whether or not you're using the scatter laser, and those big Shuriken Cannon units too, I am a fan of the Warlock who's there to potentially give Reveal, because one of the drawbacks to the Shuriken Cannon is that it only has -1 AP, which is good, but into stuff that's really durable, into hard targets that would normally save on a 2, you really do, I think, need to be able to strip cover for this to be pretty good. And the stuff that would save on a 3, well, it's just better, right? If cover isn't canceling that save out. But I think in general, we don't find ourselves using Bladestorm a ton on the Shuriken Cannon, in part because There's CP hungry stuff in the list. If you're using Fire and Fade every turn, that's 2. If you have an Autarch, that's the 2 you're generating on your turn, and then the 1 that you're getting on your opponent's turn. The grenade strat's really good. Lightning fast is really good. If you have the CP, Bladestorm can be great, especially if you really need to do a little extra damage to a particularly hard target. But I rarely find that I can squeeze it in more than once a game. Also, if you're doing the combo with the Shroud Runners where you get lethal hits, well, obviously lethal hits and Bladestorm work at cross purposes, which is a bit of a bummer because if you're automatically wounding when you roll a hit, then you're not rolling to wound, so you end up with fewer 6s, and so that's also that can also be a little bit of a relevant issue. So those are the basic moving pieces. You can also, if you're not including the Warlocks or not all of your squads have Warlocks, your Vipers can also be used to strip cover from particular targets. So that's also worth considering, I suppose, the cover stripping ability on the Viper. So that, I guess, is really all of the relevant tools. And I think one of the things that I find really satisfying about playing with Windriders and also running these Saim-Hann style lists is it feels a little bit more like traditional Eldar in this 10th edition iteration of the game with our detachment bonus where we automatically reroll a hit roll and a wound roll. It hasn't felt, and there's no psychic phase anymore, it hasn't felt as necessary as an Eldar player to get the most out of our units to like use overlapping combinations of stratagems and psychic buffs, which is how Space Elves have always worked in the past, and it makes you feel sort of like a virtuoso or a badass when you're playing your opponent and you're like, yes, this unit only looks like it's pretty good, but once my crazy elf who's been lost on the path of the seer buffs it this way, and this other elf who's just on the path of the seer debuffs you in this way, and I use this stratagem, haha, now you're in real trouble, right? Like we don't really get to do that as much as we used to, and you really do with Windriders. But it also means that they're a higher skill cap unit that can be frustrating and unforgiving for new players, because if you forget some aspect of the combo, they don't work very well. And if you just don't move them quite right, they all die, and a unit of 9 of them is really expensive. So they are really good. They're objectively really good. There's lots of GT lists that have done reasonably well with big units of Windriders with shuriken cannons, but they're not an easy unit to use well if you're a new player. The other way that you can run Windriders, of course, is in 3s or 6s, and there are some advantages to each of these. If you're running them in 3s, you don't give them a leader. If you're running them in 3s, at this point they're sort of disposable. They're pretty inexpensive. At 80 points, they're just a little cheaper than some of your other fast units, and sort of first equal with stuff like Shroud Runner. So if you need to use something to move block or to sacrifice to score a secondary, a small unit of Windriders is certainly appropriate for that. And if you run them in 6s, they're kind of in this, if you don't give them a leader at 160 points, they're in this interesting place where like you can throw a unit away to score if you really need to, but they have enough firepower to do some damage. I find I don't really, I have a little bit of a hard time with the 6 simply because it's just enough that then I do kind of want to add the Warlock, but then if I add the Warlock, it's too expensive to be sacrificial. And at that point, I have enough points into it that I just kind of want to have the 9. I think this might just be personal preference, but you can run small disposable scoring units. You can run big, powerful target elimination units that can multi-class into scoring. And again, don't forget, if you have 9 models in the unit and you need to move and then charge onto an objective, well, that's 20, even though they're crappy melee attacks, that's 27 melee attacks. And if you have some leaders in the unit, they also might have some slightly better melee, which can help you get a little bit of extra movement to get onto an objective, and can also help you clear out enemy infantry. If you do want a little extra melee bite in there too, you can also throw an Autarch Skyrunner in. I'm really not sold on the Autarch Skyrunner. I'll talk about him a little bit. Shane and his GT list included one because he was just absolutely determined to do the thematic thing. But I think of all of the like obviously Saim-Hann-esque units, That one is maybe the least good, possibly including Shining Spears. It's a little bit of a toss-up. But theoretically, if you did want to include one and you stuck it in a unit of Windriders, it would give them some bite in melee, and that's not, it's not bad. It definitely could do some good work for you. So again, I rushed through that a little bit faster than I usually rush through in-depth unit focus stuff. But I talked about Windriders so much in the Farseer Skyrunner video that I think if you want to hear more about Windriders or have this information presented slightly differently and marginally recapped, you just watch that other video too. When you deploy them, think about where they're going to need to be on turn 1 to get beads, keep them totally out of line of sight. Think about where your big unit is going to go. Like, you have to plan it all out. Like, so I'm going to move here to shoot this, and then I need to make sure I'm within range of this place when I fire and fade, where I'll be completely out of line of sight. So they require a lot of planning. It's not as hard as you might think to hide the bases for 9 of these, because you can sort of squirrel them around, like you would with infantry. So it's not like trying to hide a super heavy tank or something. When I started playing with them, I was a little bit worried that the footprint of the unit was going to be so big that they would be just a little bit too hard to hide. And I have not found that to be true, which is good. Okay, let's talk some big picture Saim-Hann stuff and talk about the other units that make sense to have in a Saim-Hann list and how they need to synergize with one another, and also with those Windriders, who, let's face it, they're the most important thematic unit in a Saim-Hann list. Shane's list had 27, the most that you could reasonably have. I think for people to look at your list and be like, that's a Saim-Hann list, you need more than 9. You can't just have one big jet bike blob. I'm going to arbitrarily say that my own sense of the minimum is 15, like a 9 and a 6 or a 9 and 2 3s. I think probably you're better off with 18. I kind of like 2 9s, but you definitely need enough that people look at when your army's on your display board or whatever, they see all the jet bikes, and that is the most notable thing in the list. I mean, that's what a Saim-Hann list is, right? You look at the thing and you say, ooh, bikes, lots of bikes, especially wild riders. But equally, obviously the Autarch Wayleaper is very archetypally Saim-Hann. And then the other bike stuff, Vipers clearly are a very Saim-Hann-esque unit, and that can be a disposable, fast scoring piece that also gets you some heavy weapons on the table. You don't have a ton of access. In the Windriders can't fly around with bright lances, so you probably want, in 10th edition, you want some bright lances somewhere. Having those on some Vipers absolutely makes sense. Shining Spears, well, if you are going to become an aspect warrior on Saim-Hann, it just seems sort of obvious that there would be more Shining Spears than anything else. So I think it's arguably true that you should have at least one unit of these things. Although certainly in the fluff and the literature, it's not like there's tons of Shining Spears flying around everywhere on Saim-Hann. It is mostly wild riders, but nevertheless, it makes sense to think that on Saim-Hann, the Shining Spears shrines would probably be the most numerous. And then, of course, Shroud Runners. If you are going to be from Saim-Hann and you're on Path of the Outcast and you're coming back to help out your craft world, if you used to be a wild rider, you're probably a Shroud Runner, not just a scout running around in the woods with a knife and a long rifle, like Natty Bumpo of Elves. And then I think the other units that sort of work thematically in a Saim-Hann list, just in terms of play style, are other things that are sort of hit and run fast units. Swooping Hawks, and honestly with Baharoth, I think feel really appropriate in a Saim-Hann list, just in terms of play style. I'll talk about that a little bit. Hornets, right? The Forge World, like bigger than a bike, smaller than a tank, kind of a souped up bike. Hornets give you additional bright lances and are cheap enough to be disposable and scory. I think warp spiders are totally legit. I mean, they're fast, they're nippy. Again, they're not like thematically, archetypally Saim-Hann-y, but the general play style that's going to suit the craft world will work well with them. They They won't break the vibe on the table. And then any fast assault tank like the Falcon. If you are going to have infantry, having it be mounted in a Falcon, mechanized infantry, I think that's the way you would do it. And certainly in all of the images of Saim-Hann war hosts run by people who work at Games Workshop and White Dwarf going all the way back, usually they've got some, Red Guardians and red other stuff. So having them in nippy tanks would make sense if you're going to run anything else. And then I think there's like an argument for the Lynx because it's like this heavy tank, but it's really fast. And I'm not really going to talk about the Lynx here. The biggest issue I've run into, the Lynx is super fast. It's actually one of the fastest models available to Eldari because it can like do this crazy extra advance move. So it can score a secondary on turn 1 and be all the way into your opponent's like backfield. And I think it has 16 wounds and it's got a 5-up invuln and it has some good fire output and your opponent has to deal with it. It can be kind of a fun trick in a blitz list. But the problem with super heavy tanks is they're just initially too hard to hide. The Lynx is like almost there, but not really. So generally, I think the way a Saim-Hann list wants to play is it's a super quick, like fire and fadey, hit and run list that you're not running any like anvil units. So I wouldn't run the Avatar of Cain. I wouldn't run a bunch of Wraithguard, even though their GW has been for years showing us lots of pictures of Saim-Hann Wraith units for some reason. I think what makes the playstyle for this craft world unique and different from the others is that there is no anvil unit. Although I think that also makes sense for a Autarch. And then the other one is the whole list is fast enough to, at any given moment in the game, utterly change the terms of engagement. So this is multiple armies in 40K play this way. In earlier editions, sometimes this has been the most efficient way to play Eldari. People who like Corsair builds tend to like this kind of play style where at any given moment, so the way this works is I have a bunch of fast units and I deploy them in my deployment zone, like across my deployment zone, but out of line of sight in a way that forces my opponent to deploy to be able to try to engage me and deal with me anywhere on the table. But then my list is fast enough that what I do is I get my opponent to commit in multiple places on the board. Like, so I move up one flank, maybe I move up each flank with big units of bikes, but I keep them in cover and I've got my Shroud Runners making pre-game moves and they're behind cover. And I'm spread out across the whole board. And because 10th edition is so much about objective control and board control and secondary scoring, you kind of have to oppose me everywhere. But then what I can do is on my turn, move everything in my army to one part of the board where I'm out of line of sight to most of your army, but have overwhelming firepower against one part of your army. And then when you move to engage me there, I do the same thing again and I appear somewhere else. And that's kind of how Saim-Hann wants to play, is you always outgun your opponent in one spot. You force them to spread out to engage you everywhere, and then you engage them in one single place where you win, and then they have to shift to engage you there, and then you change the terms of engagement again, so they can never quite get a bead on enough of your army to cripple you, and you always have an opportunity to have overwhelming firepower somewhere. And then because of how 10th edition works, you have enough cheap throwaway units that you can be nipping out with, like, I don't know, a disposable unit of 3 Windriders or a single Viper or a single unit of Shroud Runners, or even Shining Spears at 100 points now can do this, or a single Hornet, stuff that is 100 points or less to like run into board corners or to score behind enemy lines or to jump on an objective in the midfield for secondary scoring purposes and then die. So in order to make that work, pretty much everything in your army has to be pretty quick. And this is why I say I think units like Swooping Hawks, especially with Baharoth. I made a unit focus unit on that. If you're video on that, and if you're going to run that combo, I'd watch the video. But Swooping Hawks on their own can simply, like, at the end of your opponent's turn, leave the table and then come in out of deep strike on your turn, which makes them a really powerful both target elimination tool, but also scoring tool. And then with Barry, if he's in the unit, after they shoot, like Shadow Specters, they can move, which is really good. So they become this hit and run unit that can disappear and then reappear anywhere on the table. But also they have high volume of fire and they all have lethal hits, which has crazy good synergy with those Farseer Skyrunners. Because if you throw Quicken, what is this, 8th edition? If you throw Guide on a big unit of Hawks with Barry, just the Hawks are putting out 40 shots with lethal hits. And if you're targeting something that's really tough and you just start by rerolling everything that's not a 6, you can find yourself doing some real damage. And again, Blade Storm is one of those stratagems that when your swooping Hawks are in a big unit with Barry, even though lethal hits works at cross purposes with Blade Storm, it occasionally makes sense. Also, Swooping Hawks have the grenade stratagem and gets you close enough to do a few extra mortal wounds. It's pretty cool. Warp Spiders too. I'm a huge Warp Spider fan. I need to do a kind of newly this edition too. I need to do a Warp Spider unit focus video in the near future. But the fact that Warp Spiders have high volume of fire and devastating wounds and are like literally the fastest unit we have, they can just move like 24 inches and then dump a bunch of fire into something. A bunch of those hits will be devastating. So if you're targeting something like, I don't know, an enemy Avatar of Cain, Warp Spiders can weirdly like put some wounds on that with devastating wounds, and they're just cheap enough to be disposable. And they just have that right vibe that with the Shroud Runners and the Windriders and the Vipers to be able to just completely change the terms of engagement and be somewhere else on the table. Shadow Specters sort of do this too. I find my Shadow Specters, maybe it's just the way I play them, end up kind of hanging out in one part of the table and poking their heads out and shooting and disappearing and poking their heads out and shooting. I don't find them maybe quite fast enough to play this game. I haven't found myself tempted to put them into my really thematic Saim-Hann lists, even though they're really good. This general playstyle also works for Autarch Wayleapers. You need an Autarch in your list just to generate the extra CP. I've already made a video on the Autarch Wayleaper. It's really good. You give it the fusion gun, you give it the Starglade, and it has Lone Operative, which allows you to control the objective in your own backfield, which is not bad. But of course, there's always the possibility, if you're a true Saim-Hann player, that you're going to insist on running the Autarch Skyrunner. Now, I'm going to say, if you do this, I really think it is, at this point, that is a thematic decision. I get it. It makes sense. I think if I were really determined, if I were not an Imbecile player, if I were a true Saim-Hann player, I would probably insist on doing it. The Autarch Skyrunner has a couple of significant disadvantages when compared to the Wayleaper, the most significant of which is that it does not have Lone Operative. That's just kind of a bummer. Also, its weapon loadout options are kind of a little bit of a bummer, I think. So you can give it, it comes default with a laser lance, which is pretty decent. It has 4 attacks in melee, hitting on 2s. It's strength 4, but it's got that lance keyword that gives it the bonus to wound, -3 AP, 2 damage. It's pretty good. Or you could swap that out and give it a dragon fusion gun or a banshee blade. Honestly, I feel like if you're going to swap it out, maybe you should get the dragon fusion gun and the banshee blade. I don't know. So the Autarch Skyrunner doesn't have, it's fast with its 14-inch move, but the Wayleaper's fast. And it just doesn't really, it doesn't have anything to make up for the fact that it's not the Autarch Wayleaper. Not having Lone Operative is like, that's big. It also doesn't have the grenade keyword. The grenade keyword is really good. The Wayleaper can shoot something with its fusion gun and then use fate dice to cheat into doing a crap load of damage. And then its Starglaive is like pretty good in combat. It's frankly not that far off the laser lance. So the Autarch Skyrunner gets either a fusion gun or he gets a decent melee weapon and he doesn't have the fusion gun, or I'm sorry, and he doesn't have the grenade keyword and he doesn't have lone operative. The advantage to the Autarch Skyrunner is that he's only 90 points instead of 115. He's also got, I guess he's got Ride the Wind. So this used to be a thing that all jet bikes could do. Now they can do it if he's flying around with them. He can only lead Windriders. And if he's leading Windriders, when the unit advances, it just automatically moves 6. The problem is Windriders generally want to have either scatter lasers, and probably not scatter lasers, but if not a shuriken cannon, a scatter laser. And those don't have the assault keyword. So there's kind of, there's kind of no reason to ever advance with them unless it's just for scoring purposes, in which case you could use a fate die to automatically move 6 if you really needed to, or the stratagem that lets you do that. And the fact that maybe he could make a group of Windriders kind of cool in melee because his melee profile is good, and then they do have a lot of attacks even though they're not very strong. Well, that advance ability is mutually exclusive with charging, so he just doesn't have great, he doesn't really have great synergy with Windriders. So here's what I would do. I own an Autarch Skyrunner. I'm going to be honest. I've been playing around a lot with jet bike lists. I haven't run mine into anything especially competitive. But if I were going to, and I were absolutely determined to use this build, and if your elves are all painted red, I think you should. What I would do is give him the Phoenix Gem. And the fact that he's 25 points cheaper than the Wayleaper somewhat compensates for the increased cost of the Phoenix Gem in the last Balanced Data Slate update. At 90 points, he's just cheap enough to kind of be a disposable scoring unit. But what's cool about giving him the Phoenix Gem is that then he can run out onto an objective if he needs to in the midfield, die to enemy shooting, and still hold it. He has 125 points at this point, but then at least he's kind of a clutch scoring tool. Or you just leave him at 90 points and you use him for cleanup and scoring in the late game. In the late game, an Autarch Skyrunner is not a bad little cleanup unit. There's also not a ton of stuff in this list. If you have units that are getting caught up in melee, we don't have a ton of stuff to counterpunch in melee, so an Autarch Skyrunner isn't bad. Similarly, that unit of Shining Spears, what are you going to do with it? Well, if it's an MSU unit of Shining Spears, you give the Exarch, the Better Lance, and the Shuriken Cannon, and you use them for scoring and for clearing infantry off of objectives. And again, at 100 points, they are kind of disposable. You do all the things that you would use with a disposable unit with moderately good combat and a 5-up invulnerable save. Theoretically, if you have an Autarch Skyrunner and a small unit of spears, you could use them in combination. You get close, you shoot with the spears. Incidentally, if you have a unit of Shroud Runners and you throw lethal hits on something, and you get close with your Autarch Skyrunner and your Shining Spears, you can do okay. The multi-damage profile for the shooting on the spears is okay, and then the AP is okay. And lethal hits will maybe help you get a couple of extra damage on something. But generally, I think you want to think of your Autarch Skyrunner and your Shining Spears as kind of disposable cleanup and scoring units that might actually be meaningful fighting in the late game, but nothing you really want to build around. Okay, let's talk about the Shroud Runners. I keep mentioning that that their target acquisition ability, where they pick a unit within 12 inches, it's got to be visible also, which is kind of a bummer. And friendly Eldari units, including themselves, can get lethal hits. That's kind of an important detail of the ability too, because sometimes similar abilities will give friendly units whatever the bonus is after this unit has shot the thing. But that's not true of Shroud Runners. It doesn't have to be the thing that they're shooting, and because it happens at the start of your shooting phase, not when they shoot, that means they can also grant themselves lethal hits against stuff, which is cool. There are a bunch of reasons I really like Shroud Runners in this edition. For one thing, they're cheap. at 80 points for a unit of 3. And I think you generally do want to run them in 3s. 80 points is just cheap enough that they're really quite disposable as a scoring unit. But they're kind of durable because they've got 3 wounds each, unlike the regular bikes, which have 2, and you get 3 in a unit. So an 80-point unit of Shroud Runners is T4 with a 14-inch move. They've got a 4-up save, but they have a 5-up invulnerable save, and they have stealth too, so they're -1 to hit, which gives them a little bit of extra survivability. They end up just being because they're only 80 points, they're just a little bit more resource intensive to eliminate than they should be for their cost, which is good. And that lethal hits ability, if you're running a true Saim-Hann list and you need your jet bikes to be able to damage big stuff, the ability that your Shroud Runners gives your bikes, your other units, to multi-class into being able to damage big stuff, especially in combination with Quicken why do I keep saying Quicken instead of Guide? Especially in combination with Guide is really important. But the other reason that I really like Shroud Runners is that they don't take up real estate in your backfield. If you are playing Saim-Hann and you're running a bunch of big bike units and Vipers and other stuff, you can quickly kind of run out of spaces to hide units at the beginning of the game. You're not starting with a ton of stuff in Deep Strike or anything. And so Shroud Runners are cool because you put them out in the open, but then they have that 9-inch scout move before the game starts, so they can grab real estate out of line of sight in the midfield, which is cool. They also help to screen out your opponent's units that can make pregame moves. And that's just really good. It's just really good. And then their own shooting isn't bad. Each of the bikes has a Ranger long rifle, which has a 36-inch range, only 1 shot, precision, -1 AP and flat 2 damage, which is cool. I haven't been playing a ton of Rangers in this edition. I tend to forget. That 2 damage is pretty nice. And then the scatter laser, 3 of these things put out 18 scatter laser shots, 6 shots each. Again, 36-inch range, hitting on 3 is strength 5, no AP, 1 damage, but good into stuff like orcs, which we're seeing a lot of, not bad into stuff like Necrons. So their shooting ends up being good when you play into Horde armies, Tyrannid swarms, and when you're not playing into Horde armies, their scoring potential as a disposable unit in combination with lethal hits absolutely makes them worth having. They're very good. I'm currently running 2 of these things in my jet bikey Saim-Hann list. Now, in part, that's because I own 2 squads of them. In Shane's GT list, he ran 3. I think there's a definite argument for 3. But I think even if I owned a 3rd squad, I might be sticking to 2 simply because with the scout move, sometimes the amount of opportunity to hide stuff in the midfield, because to really be out of line of sight, you have to kind of be up against the obscuring piece of terrain, so your opponent can't just move to get a beat on you. And 9 inches is good, but I still find it easier to hide 2 units than 3 units. Okay, Vipers. Obviously, in a Saim-Hann list, I think you need 3 Vipers. I think that's the move. In earlier iterations of the game, you've been able to run these things in squads. Now they're singleton models at 85 points. Each one comes with some underslung shuriken catapults and a heavy weapon. You want the Bright Lance. If you run 3 Vipers and you have some Hornets in your list, you can get 7 Bright Lances into the list, and I think you need that. So in combination with the ability to use trickery and overlapping buffs to target really durable stuff, you have the target elimination that you need for like hulls and monsters. Also the range, the 36-inch range on the Bright Lance ends up being important. And then of course that ability to strip cover saves makes stuff like your shuriken cannons, if they're not getting reveal from a warlock, or other Vipers or other stuff, your Hornets, other stuff in the list more effective. The cover stripping, the Bright Lance with its -3 AP is like good, but because it's not -4, being able to take somebody to a 6-up save instead of a 5-up save is a pretty considerable difference. And so that cover stripping is really valuable. The Viper has the same move as the regular jet bike with 14 inches. It's T6, which is nice. It's got a 3-up save, no invuln, 6 wounds. And because it's got the vehicle keyword, don't forget that you can fly it into stuff and trigger vehicle shock, which can be especially useful in the late game to dump mortal wounds on things. But just at 85 points, again, it's cheap enough to be really good for secondary scoring, and it is a thematic platform for a Bright Lance, and you're going to need hard target a limb on top of the massed fire with guide from your jet bikes and maybe hawks or whatever else. So Vipers are good. I think you want 3. And I think whether or not you're using your Vipers or your Shroud Runners, because they're about the same price as your pretty disposable scoring units, depends on what kind of opponent you're playing into. How badly do you need those Bright Lances versus the ability to put lethal hits on stuff and massed anti-infantry fire? But probably it's going to be your Vipers and your Shroud Runners that you're trading for secondary scoring from relatively early in the game before anything else. Okay, the Hornet, the Forge World option. Some of you may not have Hornet. The Hornets were really good 1 edition ago, and so it's Forge World, so some people don't have, some may have none. Others of you may have like 9 of these things that you haven't been using. And in 10th edition, the most that you can have is 3 because they come in squads of 1 now. So the Hornet is like a souped up, better version of the Viper, kind of, that fills a slightly different role. It's the same speed as the Viper or a jet bike at 14 inches, but it's a little bit more durable at T7. It's got a slightly better save at a 3-up. It has 8 wounds instead of 6, and it has OC2. That's cool. And then it comes default with a pair of Hornet pulse lasers, each of which fires 2 shots at strength 9, hitting on 3s, -2, D3 damage. Don't love D3 damage. So unreliable. Or you can swap those out for other heavy weapons. Generally, people swap them for Bright Lances. So if you've got a couple of Hornets in your list, that's 4 more Bright Lance shots, and that can get you there because your 3 Vipers, if you have 3 of them, will give you 3 Bright Lances, and then a couple of Hornets takes you to 7, which is like a bit more like it. And if you keep in mind that you can always use a Fate die to kick your damage on a pulse or on a Bright Lance up to 8 when you really need to, that's good. The other nice thing about having Farseer Sky Runners in a Saim-Hann list is just because of how the list works, it's so quick. You're close enough to be able to use the Branching Fates Fate dice ability on your fast bike units, where in a more conventional Eldari list where you're running a Foot Farseer, you might be doing that on, like, I don't know, a support weapon in your backfield, and that's not going to work with your speedy bikes and your Hornets and whatever. At 100 points, the Hornet is going to play very similarly, honestly, to the Viper and the Shroud Runners. It's just that it's a little bit more expensive. It has twice the anti-hard target fire output of the Viper. It doesn't strip cover, but it's better. So obviously you're not going to throw it away. If you're trading stuff to score, this is going to be something that you would trade to score in the late game, not in the first 3 turns of the game. But there's one additional thing that's cool about the Hornet, one additional thing that you can do with it. It's got this datasheet ability, Lightning Assault. Each time this model ends a normal move, you can select one enemy unit, excluding monster and vehicle units that it moved over during that move, and you roll 66, and for each 4-up, the enemy suffers a mortal wound. So basically, it gets the grenade stratagem for free for anything it moved over effectively, and then you could still use the grenade stratagem somewhere else, which is awesome, except in practice, 14 inches sounds like a long way, but unless your opponent is running an aggressive melee army that really wants to be in your face, it's actually pretty hard to move over anything. So one trick you have available to you is that Fire and Fade counts as a normal move. So you could move this thing, you could shoot an enemy unit, and then you could Fire and Fade another 14 inches over the enemy unit, moving a total of 28 inches, which will help you with stuff like scoring behind enemy lines and dump some mortal wounds on something that you just flew over. And again, that feels very Saim-Hann, where you're changing the circumstances of engagement at sort of a drop of a hat, while also doing some fun extra damage. Okay, so other units you may want to consider. I've already mentioned, I think, just in terms of the overall hit and run play style, Hawks and Baharoth, the Autarch Wayleaper, totally makes sense. In theory, the aircraft would, but I think they're not really good enough. Fire prisms, or night spinners, I guess, but they're kind of static units in the backfield. There's certainly nothing wrong with it. They would satisfy the fewer boots on the ground guideline. I wouldn't do it. Warlock conclaves, with their auto hitting weapons and their spears and their destructor, can be really fun running around board edges in casual play, cleaning stuff up, but they don't really get there, I don't think, for tournament play. So the other thing that I would say is anything coming out of a Falcon. If you are running infantry, it does make a certain amount of sense, because Banshees are fast. You could do, you could put Fire Dragons in a Falcon. Again, they're used so often in conventional 40k elf lists that it might not be as emotionally and narratively satisfying to bring something like Fire Dragons out of a Falcon when you're already kind of doing that a lot. But again, I think that if you do want to have infantry, mounting them will make it more consistent with the rest of the vibe of the army. And then the other thought, I think that if Harlequins fly around the galaxy, that travel around the webway, going to various craft worlds and helping out, obviously, if you're a Saim-Hann player, in order to keep up, your Harlequin allies would need to be on bikes. I think that Skyweavers and Voidweavers are totally consistent with the vibe. I've talked about both of those units in other videos, particularly my Harlequin video, so I'm not going to do it here. They both bring extra hard target elimination, which is one of the things that this list can struggle with a little bit. But then the other thing that's really, the other way in which they're consistent with the vibe of the lists, and I think it's one of my favorite things about this type of Eldari build, is that normally in most Space Elf builds, there are certain units that are pretty essential, that when you lose certain tools, things start to sort of come apart. But what we have in the Saim-Hann lists, with the exception of, say, a couple of big 9-elf bike units that you're going to be careful with and use Fire and Fade to keep alive, everything else is kind of disposable. There's nothing that your opponent can take away from you that's really going to make problems for you. You don't want to lose your Sky Runner, your two Farseer Sky Runners, which is one of the reasons I like to just attach them to the bike units, because you already have a vested interest in keeping those things safe anyway. But everything else is pretty disposable. That each individual unit of Vipers, or each individual Hornet, or each individual unit of Shroud Runners, or each individual Hornet, or if you do have micro units of Wild Riders, you don't really need any of it, which is cool. And that's also more or less true of at least small Skyrunner Harlequin units. By the way, that's another reason that I'm not crazy, even though the Lynx is really fast and kind of suits the speedy playstyle of Saim-Hann, I'm not crazy about it because it's just a little too expensive and a little bit too hard to hide. But if you're looking for an excuse to run your list, or your Lynx, it's certainly thematically appropriate for the list. Last note, objective control can be a little touch and go in a Saim-Hann list. So again, having the Autarch Wayleaper, making that compromise to have a lone operative can really help. It's also worth at least considering maybe kind of having a single unit of Storm Guardians so you can make objectives sticky. It's not the worst idea. I probably wouldn't spend all the points to have a wave serpent to stick them in so that they could get around. But like being able to make your own backfield objectives sticky and then move them out of line of sight into the midfield and then jump on a midfield objective somewhere where you've killed everything with your bikes. Because remember, part of the vibe of this army is the ability to just abruptly shift all of your resources to a different part of the field. It's really the central notion, I think, to abruptly shift all of your resources to a different part of the field to overwhelm the opponent. Well, if every turn you've got to leave something behind to control an objective or whatever, that can create issues. So I certainly don't think you need to take Storm Guardians, but they synergize reasonably well. And they feel a little bit more thematically Saim-Hann because they're aggressive. But you may also just want to play around the objective issue in other ways, like by taking away your opponent's tools and holding them when they're safe to hold, like a traditional elf player. So that's pretty much what I've got on this. I mean, I think you have a couple of options if you do want to run Saim-Hann or if you already run Saim-Hann. And one is a very traditional, highly thematic list like Shane's list, where you're starting with 27 Windriders and you are running a no boots on the ground list. That's a rule you're setting for yourself. No boots on the ground. Boots on the ground will slow us down. In which case, I think you're just to make the points work, you definitely max out Vipers, probably max out Shroud Runners. We've already established you're maxing out the Windriders. To some degree, that list is kind of set for you to some degree. But if you're willing to be a little bit more flexible and run a Saim-Hann list that is like what you might have seen in a White Dwarf 15 years ago, where you look at it and you know it's Saim-Hann because there's a ton of jet bikes, but there is other stuff too. It's still all the aspect shrines still exist on that world. There are still regular guardians and so on. Then I think there's a lot of versatility available to you in terms of what you play and how you play. I really like the Hawks in there a lot. The big unit of 10 Hawks that can move after they shoot with Barry, but also be anywhere they want to be on the board. I think that synergizes beautifully with the Saim-Hann playstyle. I think the Warp Spiders, similarly, having something that can be in your opponent's backfield on turn one and just dump mortal wounds on something and also help you score behind enemy lines, it's clutch. I think you just need to make sure that you've got a big enough, that everything you're including is still consistent with that hit and run, somewhat disposable play style, but also you have enough bikes that the identity of the list is immediately obviously clear when anybody looks at it. You have more Windriders than you have anything else individually, and you've got the Vipers, you've got the Shroud Runners, and so on. Don't forget the grenade stratagem with the Hawks or your Way Leaper. If you have it, don't forget you can vehicle shock stuff with the Vipers. Don't forget to occasionally consider Bladestorm. But in general, Fire and Fade, Lightning Fast, Overwatch, these are going to be your tools. And don't forget the tremendous synergies created by guide or the natural rerolls on the bikes with stuff like sustained hits or lethal hits in combination with the Shroud Runners. That really is those combos really are the engine of the list combined with the mobility. And last note before I just do wrap up, when I made the Farseer video, multiple people pointed out in the comments that I was wrong when I said that it makes sense if you're running sustained hits, one Windriders to fish for sixes. I looked at the math. You're right. Where were you before my last Windrider heavy tournament? No, I don't know what was wrong with me. It does make sense. So the notion that you would reroll everything that's not a 6 does make sense when you're rerolling for lethal hits into something that's really durable, where you're like only wounding on 6s. It also makes sense for guide when you have a bonus to hit, such that for sustained hits 1, if you can hit on 2s. And it can also make sense if you if it's better than sustained hits 1. But when you're hitting on 3s with sustained hits 1, it does make sense to simply reroll misses rather than rerolling everything that's just a 6. But when you're using guide on units in combination with your Shroud Runners or just on Swooping Hawks, re-rolling everything that's not a 6 to generate lethal hits into hard targets really makes sense. Also, remember, if you combine sustained hits and lethal hits via the Shroud Runners, your shuriken cannons on your bikes will both auto wound with one hit and then generate an extra hit with the other die. Some newer players are under the impression that if you have both lethal hits and sustained hits, both hits auto wound. That is not the case. The one hit auto wounds, and then you have to roll the second die. But that's a really powerful combo, and really dials the fire output on the Windriders with the shuriken cannons up to 11, which is great. Okay, so there it is. Windriders playing Saim-Hann, building for Saim-Hann, and some potential pitfalls and strengths and weaknesses. If you have your own ideas about how to run either Windriders or Saim-Hann effectively, please mention those in the comments below. And on the off chance that you're out there listening in New Zealand, Shane, hats off to you. Really impressed with your performance with that list. It's always inspiring to see highly thematic, well-run off-meta lists do especially well. Okay, thanks everyone. Back again soon with more content. And thanks as always to you Patreons. You're very special. I'll link the Patreon page in the video description in case any of you are interested in joining our Discord or getting some other benefits too. Bye. Take care.